Hi everybody, this is Pastor Clint from Grace Covenant Presbyterian, getting you ready for our worship service this Sunday. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of John. Our small group started this week, and we're reading the book by Adam Hamilton, John, the Gospel of Light and Life. Last week we looked at the introduction to the Gospel of John, the first few verses of the first chapter. This week, in the book, he moves on to talking about the miraculous signs of Jesus. And there's a reason he doesn't say the miracles of Jesus that's particular to John. In John's Gospel, when Jesus does a miracle, it's not just a miracle, as if there's such a thing as just a miracle, but the miracle is very much tied to being a sign of who Jesus is. The miracle itself is symbolic. So he's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about a couple of the miracles in the gospel story. So I thought for worship, rather than repeating what he's already going to be talking about and talking about two other miracle stories, that we would talk about a third miracle story so you can get a little broader view of the miracle stories in John, the miraculous sign stories in John, shall I say. So we're going to be looking at John chapter 6, the first 14 verses. There's actually two miraculous sign stories in John chapter 6. One is the feeding of the 5,000 that we're going to read. And then immediately following on that is Jesus stilling the waters. Jesus walking on the water and stilling the waters. So, but we're just going to focus on the first part of those, the first of those two miraculous sign stories. The feeding of the 5,000 is an interesting story textually because it's one of the stories that appears in all four Gospels in some form. And so that's important and that's significant, and tells us that story may be more important than we give it credence to, that all four gospel writers decided that story was important enough to tell. And I think Matthew actually tells that story twice, tells of two different incidents, tells that story twice. So it was really important for the gospel writers to include this story in their Gospels. They thought it said something very important about who Jesus was. So John's telling of this story is probably the most familiar because of one detail that he includes, and that is the detail of the boy with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. That detail of the story really sort of sets it off and sort of gets it in your mind and makes it stand out. So I'm going to read the passage real quickly, and then we're going to walk through and talk about a couple of the details of it. So this is John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the disciples sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world." So, with a lot of familiar stories, it can be helpful to sort of do a close reading of the text. So I wanted to pull out a couple of the pieces of the text to talk about. The first thing is, it makes reference to Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. So that's a tip-off to Jewish audience versus Roman audience. The Romans would have called it the Sea of Tiberias. The Jews would have known it as the Sea of Galilee, which is what we still know it as today. And it says a large crowd kept following him. So here he is, he's going to the other side of the sea. It doesn't say if he went by boat, but that was presumably what you would do. And the crowd managed to follow him, which is a different detail than the other versions of the story have. It says, Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down. So this crowd, because they know he's healing the sick and doing all this, they're following him even across the water, which was no small endeavor, I would imagine. And then it says, Jesus went up to the mountain, sat down, and then it says the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. So this is tipping us off both the time of year this is. This would have been probably in the spring at some point. And the Passover festival was a significant event. The Passover story from Moses, where the Israelites were getting themselves together to go out, because that was the night of the last plague on Egypt, when the firstborn sons would be killed, and the next morning they would be leaving. And this was really the central primary festival in the Jewish faith. And so in Jesus' time, this was also the primary time of pilgrimage. This was the time when people would leave their homes and go to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. The city would be bursting with people. And so the reason I think John includes that detail here is, in this story, the people are making a pilgrimage to see Jesus. They're crossing the water to see Jesus, just like the pilgrims make a passage, usually by land, to go and see Jesus to go and see the Passover festival in Jerusalem. And so Jesus goes up the mountain, he sees the crowd, and he asks Philip, one of the disciples, a question: where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? And Philip's answer is interesting, because Philip doesn't answer the question. Philip keys in on the word buy, and realizes that they don't have enough money to buy food for this many people. So instead of answering, where are we going to do that, which is equally an interesting question. If you're kind of in a wilderness, buying food for 5,000 people on a moment's notice is no easy logistical task. And yet Philip doesn't respond to that. The natural answer would have been, there's nowhere we can do that. He responds to the monetary part of this. 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to have a little. So he's thinking in terms of the cost. And then in the sort of the most unusual part of this is when Andrew brings up the boy, who has 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Now that's a detail that we're so familiar with that we don't question it. But how often would children be walking around with that much food? Presumably just for themselves. It doesn't tell us about his family, his parents, if he's traveling with a group of people. It just tells us that the boy has all this food, which, is not enough for 5,000, but would be way more than enough for one child. Think 5 loaves of bread. He's really got enough food for 2 or 3 days at least for himself. But he's willing to share that. And that's, for a lot of people, that's really the key to understanding this parable, or this story, not parables, this miraculous sign, is that the boy is willing to share. So Jesus has the people sit down and they start passing out the food. And it doesn't tell us what happens between when the food is passed out and when the food is collected, other than everybody eats their fill. So some people see this in terms of, the bread somehow multiplied while it was being passed around, so that there was more when it came back than there was when it started. The fish doesn't come back, which, that's another sort of interesting detail that in this is the bread that comes back. Evidently the fish was just the right amount, or at least John doesn't tell us any more about the fish. But for some people, the idea in this parable is by seeing the boy share what he had, which was, abundant for one person but not enough for everyone, that everyone decides to share what they have. And the text doesn't really give us any way of knowing if it was either or both. The text is quiet on the how did this happen question, which is for us a lot of times exactly where our minds goes. Well, how did this happen? John's not interested in that. John doesn't tell us anything about that. John just tells us we have 5 loaves of barley bread to start with, and we have 12 baskets full of barley bread to finish. We also don't know where the baskets came from, which is, another one of those details that's kind of puzzling, is who was carrying around all these food baskets that didn't have any food in them. So that might lend some credence to the fact that there was food among the crowd and it was shared. I don't think the fact that human beings share things is any less miraculous. Getting us to overcome our sense of scarcity and fear to share what we have with others, that in itself is a miraculous thing, I think. So they gather up the 12 baskets, 12 being a very meaningful number in Judaism. It's sort of the number of completion. So it's significant that it's 12 baskets and not 9. There's a symbolic meaning to that is the number of fullness. And a big part of this story is about the abundance that comes back. That this is not just enough. This is not everybody got a little bite to eat. This was everybody ate their full, and there was all this left over. And so that's part of the symbolic nature of this. This is the sign part of the miraculous sign story, is that in Christ, in the kingdom of God, there is abundance. There is more than we could have imagined. There's more than we start out with. If we entrust our little gift in the hands of Christ, it multiplies and it becomes greater, and it's enough for everyone. And that's the real significance of this sign. And Jesus will tie this back in a little bit later in chapter 6. After the next miraculous sign, he'll be talking with the disciples, and that's when we hear him say, "I am the bread of life." And so sort of tying directly back to this story of abundant bread that is enough for everyone, Christ understands himself to be that bread that is enough for everyone and is abundant and is not just what we need to get by, but is more than our fill. So we'll be talking about this story more on Sunday, and we'll be looking at two of the other miraculous signs from the Gospel of John in our studies this week. So I hope everybody is enjoying their small group. I think most, if not all of them, have met by now. So I hope that's gone well. I'm excited to hear about your studies, and the two studies that I've been a part of so far were both outstanding. We had some great conversation. So if you haven't joined a small group yet, I hope you do so. It's not too late. And we'll see you Sunday. Be blessed.